Hello, this is a video on the philosophy of science. It's part of my series of lectures on philosophy, and if you look at the description of this video, you'll find a link to the overarching outline of all the videos. This is one of the last ones. I want to do this one, and then one on philosophy of art, and one on postmodernism and metaphysics, and we'll be at the end of, well, basically an entire philosophy course. Let's talk about the philosophy of science, shall we? Philosophy of science I consider to be a subset of the philosophy of knowledge or philosophy of truth in general. There's a word for that branch of philosophy. It's called epistemology. Basically, how do I know that I know what I think I know? We've already had a video on logic. We've had a video on perspectives on truth. We've had a video on philosophy of language. I would consider all of these pretty much to go together. And postmodernism also, I think, fits broadly into this category. So let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of science. So the classical scientific method that you probably learned, let's just face it, if you didn't learn scientific methods somewhere in your elementary, middle, high school education, you were let down, you were failed. You should have come across classic scientific methods somewhere in your school education before you finished high school. The father of the scientific method is Francis, did we say Bacon? Francis Bacon lived in the late 1500s and early 1600s, and he'd evolved this method for trying to decide whether something is true. Now, although it's hard for us to imagine, prior to Bacon, science wasn't really done by way of observation. Theology was considered to be the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages, and you don't actually have to go outdoors to do theology. You can actually go into a closet and do theology. You can take a newspaper into a particular room and sit there of the house and do theology. You can do theology anywhere because theology is largely a matter of the mind. Now, of course, it's a matter of the Bible, we would say. It's a matter of the church. And things like that. Sometimes there can be natural revelation, as we've talked about in our video on the philosophy of God. But in general, science was not done. And remember, the word science comes from the Latin scio, which means knowledge. So knowledge wasn't done by going outdoors necessarily that much prior to Francis Bacon. Bacon suggests, hey, let's observe some stuff, which of course makes consummate sense to us because we live in the scientific age, as it were. Bacon inaugurated the kind of scientific age. And we have seen such fantastical developments in science. It's unbelievable. I mean, this is a recording on the internet. What's the internet? I mean, the internet wasn't around really 40 years ago. Even 30 years ago, the internet was barely around. We have GPS devices. We have rockets that can go to Mars. I mean, we've got all kinds of technological development. It's happened clearly at a faster rate than ever in human history. The unfolding of knowledge is happening at such a rapid rate. It's just unbelievable. We have cell phones. There weren't cell phones when I was born. I mean, it's just if we could take it all in, it's unimaginable how science has been developing. Well, that all really goes back to Bacon. And of course, the 1600s with Isaac Newton and so many. Copernicus, is about the same time as Bacon, who's saying, I wonder if actually the Earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth. Well, Bacon made the shift to say, let's actually go outside and make observations. You can make observations inside too, but let's observe data in relation to a question, and then let's form hypotheses. For Bacon, it was very simplistic, column 1, column 2, let's put all the evidence for column 1 here and all the evidence for column 2 here, and then whichever, whoever has the most evidence wins. Now, Bacon was rather simplistic. We've become very sophisticated, and the philosophy of science has become very much more sophisticated. Bacon just pretty much assumed what you see is what you get. He pretty much assumed that you could be an objective observer. But of course, what we realize is that our biases actually affect what we look for. Now, I am a particularly unobservant person. My family mocks me. So there can be, let's say we have a little table here, and the thing I'm looking for is right there on the table. But let's say it's on a part of the table that I'm not looking for. I have I don't know what's wrong with me. I have tunnel vision, but when I look for things, I look for them in specific places. And so if something isn't in the specific place I'm looking, I don't often see it, even if it's within 2 or 3, inches. Well, that's probably too close. If it's within, it can be within a foot of where I'm looking. But if it's not where I'm looking, I may not see it. Now I realize I am an odd person. I have problems, but this is a microcosm of what is generally true, that we don't see some things because it's not where we're looking. It's not where we expect it to be. I had a great professor in college, Dr. Martin Labar, biology professor. He taught a course on that introduced me to Thomas Kuhn, who we're going to talk about in a second, with the idea of paradigm shifts in science. At one point in the class, Dr. Labar took us over to the window and he says, "What do you see?" Well, in my paradigm, a window is for looking out of. And so I was thinking cars, trees, that sort of thing. But then there was a clever person, I don't remember who it was, who said, "I see a window." Oh, that's what Dr. Labar was looking for. And he was basically giving us an illustration of how we have a paradigm of windows. And in the paradigm of windows, you look out of it. But there was somebody who realized, well, you could actually look at the window too. Now, I don't know, maybe this is a person who notices dirt and they notice dirt on the window or something. I don't know. I don't notice dirt, which is another problem that my family might point out. But so Bacon didn't realize the degree to which our expectations kind of steer what we look for. What we're looking for might actually be right in front of us, but we won't see it, or we'll dismiss it because it doesn't fit within what we're going to call the prevailing paradigm. But okay, that's getting ahead of ourselves. For Bacon, it was very simple. We create a hypothesis, and then we test the hypothesis, and we retest the hypothesis, and we continue to test and retest until we get to the point to where we can establish a theory. Now, a theory is a hypothesis that is proved to have significant power in predicting what's going to happen over and over and over again. And this is, of course, a difference between the scientific understanding of a theory and the popular sense of a theory. So, for example, take the theory of evolution. You may popularly hear people say, well, that's just a theory. Well, a theory in science means this has been tested, and it keeps coming out right. So a theory in science is something different from a theory in popular parlance. Although I would say that there aren't a lot of theories these days. Science has backed off, I perceive, from calling things theories anymore, because we've gotten very used in the 20th century to scientific revolutions, as we'll talk about. And so my sense is that we don't talk much about theories as much in science these days. Well, so there you have it, the scientific method. Hold that thought. We'll be back to talk about Thomas Kuhn and paradigm shifts in a second. I now want to talk about worldviews. Now, if you watched my video on the philosophy of language, you know that I kind of made fun of worldviews as generally being a little bit unreflective. Worldviews, as I often hear it talked about, are very simplistic. They don't take into account much minutia of detail. Worldview language, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little condescending here, is generally for a simpler kind of understanding, usually, in my opinion. And again, I won't mention Francis Schaeffer. Okay, so N.T. Wright, I think, gave at least an upgrade to the usual way of talking about worldviews when he said there's actually more to worldviews than just a set of simple ideas. For example, stories. I think N.T. Wright is probably correct that human beings are far more, at least in general and throughout history, human beings tend to explain the world in terms of stories more than in terms of logical propositions. Logical proposition is a fairly recent kind of way of thinking about ideas, I would say, that people tell stories. We say, well, let me tell you what it's like to be in my family. My grandfather did blah, 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 or my dad, my mother, blah, 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 blah. So stories have long featured in humanity as a way of telling who we are. The Bible is mostly, I mean, if you ask, and the number one genre in the Bible, it's mostly story. Now, where I would depart a little bit from N.T. Wright is when N.T. Wright talks about story as fundamental to worldview, he tends to talk about the mega story, what we might call the meta narrative of salvation, you know, that starts with creation and then Adam falls and then we have a fallen sinful world and Jesus comes and Jesus dies for our sins and now he's coming again and we're going to have the consummation of the ages at the end. That is a mega story. That's a meta narrative. And to some extent, I'm going to accuse N.T. Wright of oversimplifying things, because most of our stories that tell our identity are more short stories. And so there's the short story of Adam and Eve, perhaps, that we can draw on. Part of my worldview, I'll tell you, part of my worldview is I believe that human intellect is not as reason-driven as we think it is, that people are herd animals, that people follow their guts and their emotions far more than they follow reason, that people come up with reasons for what they already want to believe most of the time. The world is fallen. The world is under the power of sin. People are not, there is none righteous, no, not one. I'm quoting a verse there. But I would say that people, that the majority of people will do what's in their best interest and to their personal advantage far more than the loving thing or the right thing. So these are parts of my worldview. They come from the Bible, and I can point to stories. I can tell the story of Adam and Eve, you know, as a story. But the things I'm talking about are pieces. They're not this meta narrative story that N.T. Wright comes up with. So yes, I do think that story is a major feature of human worldview, but I think it tends to be small stories, short stories, not mega story, as N.T. Wright talks about it. I also would agree with N.T. Wright that symbols and rituals play a major part of our views of the world. I can tell you right now that flags are major symbols. It is fascinating how I'm doing this video in Western New York in 2020, and we are coming up to a very, very significant election in United States history, I think. And somehow President Trump has connected himself with the American flag. It's quite fascinating because I guarantee you that Democrats are not un-American. And yet somehow President Trump has managed to connect the symbol of the American flag with his candidacy. I'm not sure that people have articulated this, but I've noticed this. If you were to drive through Western New York, now my father was a Republican. He's passed now. We did put a American flag out once a year on July 4th, but we didn't have a flag out all the time. And so the practice of the flags out all the time right now, I suspect the homes that have that flag out are probably Trump supporters. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm crazy. It's a hypothesis. We could go out and test it by knocking on those doors and asking who they plan to vote for. But somehow he has managed to associate the flag and American patriotism with his candidacy. That's very powerful, incredibly powerful. We can make all kinds of logical arguments and say, well, Joe Biden loves America just as much as Trump does. We could come up with all kinds of reasons and arguments for something like that, but somehow the symbol is important. Movements without symbols are not nearly as powerful as movements with symbols. If you can capture a symbol, then because this is just the way the human mind works. The same goes with certain ritual practices. When we develop habits of doing certain things and rituals of certain things, it's more powerful than what we think. There are all kinds of atheists out there who go to church because it's part of who they are, and they may not even believe in what they hear from the pulpit or whatever. They often tend to be to mainline traditions, those who fall into that camp, but they're in the ritualistic practice of doing those sorts of things. It gives them a certain peace to do those sorts of things. And so Wright would say that that our stories, our symbols, our rituals, that these are parts of our worldviews, not just ideas. And of course, ideas are part of worldviews as well. What are answers to the central questions, like who are we? Where are we in history? Where's history going? What's wrong with the world? What is the solution? Now, I still think that N.T. Wright is a transitional form, as it were. I don't think N.T. Wright has quite found the perfect expressions of worldview. And I'm sad to say I don't have the perfect expression either, although I'm going to give you a bit of an outline in a second. But I haven't, to my satisfaction, come up with the perfect way to describe worldviews. But let's keep going here. Myths. What are myths? Well, the popular sense of myths is, of course, is something that's false. Well, that's a myth. Fake news. That's a myth. We also know, I think most of us know about the ancient myths, the myth of Persephone going to the underworld and it becoming winter, and then when Persephone goes back to her father in Olympus, then it becomes spring. We know, maybe vaguely remember those stories. There's one that the book Sophie's World, Justine Gardner, tells about Thor, somebody stealing his hammer. And then he finds out, he actually, it's a funny story. He dresses up like a woman and convinces the person who stole his hammer to fall in love with him. And on their wedding day, he kills the person who stole his hammer and takes his hammer back. But the fact that he doesn't have his hammer explains why winter happens, which is very interesting. But the thing is, this guy doesn't come back to life and die every year. So if the purpose of this story is as a explanation, it's a bad explanation. And so this gets us to, I think, a more sophisticated understanding of how myths function. Myths function more to express mysteries. Notice the connection between the word myth and the word mystery. I used to say that a myth is a story expressing a mystery. And so myths are, in the ancient world, were much more about expressing the mysteries of the world than explaining. And so I think that when we think of myths as explaining, we're not looking at them quite right. I would argue that science, in a way, is a lot of very precise myths. So let me tell you the myth of force equals mass times acceleration. That these symbols, F equals ma, are basically ways to express the way the world works. Now, why does the world work like that? I'm not sure we really know that. I'm not sure that science can tell us what it really is. Remember Kant from 2 videos ago on perspectives of truth? We know the world as it appears to us. We don't know the world as it is, das Ding an sich, in the world in itself. But you could argue that science gives us really, really precise myths in the form of formulas and equations and conceptual perceptions and so forth. And these are really expressions of the way the world works, not necessarily. There is, of course, some explanation involved in modern science. I would be wrong if I said something different, I think. But primarily, it's we might say that fundamentally it's an expression of the way the world works. This is especially true, I think, with things like quantum mechanics. I've been told that you can't really understand quantum mechanics. You can learn the equations, you can learn how to do the math, you can predict things, yes, but that nobody really knows what it's all about, what this actually means. Here's a quote of how we tend to create the world in our own image. This is from Xenophanes, who was an ancient Greek. And he basically talked about how we have a tendency to create God after our own image. Here's what he said. If cattle, horses, and lions had hands, if they could draw that with them and do what people do, horses would draw the gods in the shape of horses, cattle would draw them in the shape of cattle. Each animal would give the gods bodies like their own. And so this is, I think, very perceptive. There was a modern philosopher in the 1800s who, of course, said this about the Christian God. Feuerbach argued that we create God in our own image. But, of course, I believe in God. And so I would say that God as God is beyond our understanding, but that God reveals God's self to us by way of analogy. He talks goo goo gaga to us and gives us pictures that we can understand. But I do believe that Christians, even Christian theologians, have a tendency to picture God after their own manner. That many Christians, maybe most Christians, maybe almost all Christians, inevitably view God as a really good Zeus and a slightly more powerful Zeus. But for example, take emotions. I would argue that emotions are reactions. Emotions are reactions either to new information or when we relive old information. And so if God knows all things at all times, then God cannot literally experience emotions unless we want to say that God is angry all the time and God is sad all the time, you know, that because God is reacting to history all the time in all of his different emotions. We might say that he is omni-reactant. Sure, we could say something like that. But any biblical text that pictures God as being angry or sad, I would say is an anthropomorphism. It is picturing God in terms that we can understand. It's true. I'm not saying it's false. I'm saying it's true, but it's true in an anthropomorphic way. And so I'm not nearly as negative toward myths as the popular language is. Myths are much less precise expressions of the way the world is. In the end, I prefer to think of worldviews more as collections of paradigms that have similar patterns or a certain coherency to them, rather than the kind of Platonic, here's the worldview, here's your position on everything. And this fits with what I said in my video on perspectives on truth, that there is a certain Platonic fallacy, I would call it, that applies to, for example, the work of Francis Schaeffer and others, especially in the Abraham Kuyper, you know, kind of hyper-reformed perspective on worldviews that basically say any idea, I mean, this is a bit of a caricature, but any idea you have is a representation of your worldview. And I mentioned in that video how there are people who say, oh, this thing you're saying is like this thing that Marxists think, or it is like this thing that critical race theory thinks, and therefore your worldview is Marxist and critical race theory, and I can dismiss everything you say. Well, of course, we know from our logic video that whether or not an individual claim is true or false depends on whether or not that individual claim is true or false. It doesn't depend on what worldview it comes from. And so in keeping with my pragmatist approach to things, I would say that worldviews are collections of paradigms, and those paradigms may or may not all cohere perfectly. We are, again, this is my worldview, we are fundamentally contradictory thinkers as human beings. Human beings are not consistent thinkers. If you've watched me for very long, you know that I'm very sympathetic to Jonathan Haidt's sense that reason is what we use to try to justify where our guts want to go. He likens it to a rider on an elephant. Our elephants are going to go pretty much where our elephants want to go. The rider, very little control over what the elephant does. And so what our rider does most of the time is justify where the elephant wants to go. And so a worldview is more like related paradigms that fit with each other. But we can be inconsistent. We definitely can be. What kind of paradigms are we talking about? Well, identity paradigms. We have paradigms about who we are. Paradigms we tell ourselves that this is who I am. For example, you know, I'm an American, you know, or whatever. And there's maybe stories that go with that and symbols that go along with that. But we have identity paradigms. We have relationship paradigms about how I'm supposed to interrelate with other people. We have ritual or practice paradigms. What's the best way to go about doing things? And let me just say, I'm an academic, and in the academy, there are all kinds of well, that's just not the way you do it. And a lot of times I'm sitting there thinking, why? Why is that the only way you in fact, I was interviewing for a dean position once upon a time, and I said, you know, if you tell me that I have to go out the door, around the building, come back in, and then, you know, make the coffee. If that's the way that it has to be done here, that's the way I'll do it. But I just as well climb over the table and make the coffee. Why? Well, that's unsophisticated. You'll get your footprints on the table. You'll make the table dirty. You know, I mean, we just have our ways of doing things. These are paradigms. And so worldviews are collections of these paradigms. And we can call them a kind of a worldview if they all kind of loosely fit together. Maybe for some people are more consistent than others, it's true. But we look for a kind of trajectory, a pattern that goes with these. And of course, we have these meaning of the world paradigms, the really big paradigms. What is the significance of all the things that are around me? Some people don't ever even think about these things. They're not philosophical type people. They don't ask what the meaning of life is. I pictured in my mind just now, just somebody popped into my head, somebody that I knew who I doubt ever stopped and asked, what's the meaning of life? This person lived their life, they died, and I doubt they ever stopped and asked why. They're just not a why person. And so again, you can go through your whole life and not really talk much or think much about a meaning of the world paradigm. So my perspective is that worldviews are much loosier-goosier than certainly Francis Schaeffer might have suggested. Okay, now back to Thomas Kuhn, back to paradigm shifts. So in the very beginning of this video, we talked about Francis Bacon and his sense of the scientific method. Again, I believe in the scientific method. I have a cell phone, you know, I am on a video. I believe in science. I'm a card carrier. No, I don't have a card. But Thomas Kuhn points out another aspect to science that I think is very important for us to understand, and it goes well beyond science. It applies to our ways of looking at the world in general. So what Kuhn said is that our default mode is what he called normal science. This is the way that we just look at the world. For years and years and years, centuries after centuries, it was that we have a roughly flat earth with the seas at the edges, and you go straight up through layers of sky until you get to where the gods are, or where God is. And again, the New Testament, I would argue, and the Old Testament do not primarily transform these sorts of scientific paradigms. They are rather kind of the assumptions into which God brings his revelation. God incarnates the truth. He brings truth into whatever the paradigms are of the people. Now he moves them. Don't get me wrong. God doesn't just leave all the paradigms in the same place. Some aspects of them might not be essential to what the point of the revelation is. In general, God is more interested about who we are and how we live and how we treat others and that sort of thing. So don't get me wrong. God moves us when he reveals himself to us, but our default is a kind of normal understanding, our normal paradigm. And so then it was the kind of heliocentric view of the world, where the sun is the center of all things. In the 20th century, we had paradigm shifts in relativity and quantum physics and so forth. But the normal science is basically the default way of understanding things. It is very difficult to dislodge a person's normal way of looking at things. Let me just use my own family. My great-grandfather fought in the Civil War, and I am quite positive was a Republican. My grandfather, his son, was born in 1883, and he and his two sisters were very much Republicans. And of course, back in those days, the Republican Party stood very strongly against slavery, and the Republican Party stood very strongly in favor of the empowerment of blacks to vote, and so forth, and things like that. So my family was very much Republican. Now, my grandfather died. That grandfather died in 1963. He was a Republican his whole life. He wrote a book of prophecy around 1960, before the election. He was very concerned about John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, becoming a Christian. On my dad's side, I know that there were some in my dad's family who worried about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, worried about him perhaps being the Antichrist. Now, as I look back on history, I do not in any way think that FDR or JFK, I don't in any way think that they were perfect people. But FDR, it seems like he did a number or initiated a number of good things for the poor and for the elderly, Social Security. So it at least seems like he did some good things, even though I'm quite sure he wasn't a perfect person at all. In fact, many of us would know that some of the practices that have resulted in a lot of African Americans living in ghettos were a byproduct of the way the housing loan situation came out under FDR. So I'm not in any way claiming that he was perfect, but as I look back, I think, well, that there probably were a lot of good things to FDR and him being a president. We won World War II more or less under him, although he died before it was completely over. But my family has remained Republican. I doubt very seriously that my parents ever once voted for a Democrat in a presidential election. Republican is definitely the normal science of my family. It is very, very difficult. It would be very difficult then to convince anyone in my family that the Democrat was the more righteous or the better person to vote for. And I'm talking about, this goes back to well before abortion was an issue. There were other issues, back before Roe v. Wade. And of course, over time, I would argue that the Republican Party, especially in the South, has flipped sides on issues like civil rights and things like that. I don't really think Dinesh D'Souza is a personal opinion. I don't think he's actually accurately captured the discontinuity. So yes, Southern Democrats in the 1940s did tend to be very racist, it would seem. But those individuals and their heirs became the Southern Republicans of the 60s and 70s and beyond to today. What I'm getting at here is that it has been very difficult for my family, and I know many others, to not vote Republican, no matter what. It really doesn't matter to some extent who the person is. They're going to find a way to justify voting Republican. I believe it. It is their normal science. And there are other families, I'm not just picking on my family. I truly and fully believe that there are families who have voted Democrat all these years too. And although the issues have changed and the Democrats have changed, they've always voted Democrat. And I've had people ask me, how could you be a Republican, and be a Christian? I've had people ask that sort of question in the last few years. And so when we have a default paradigm, when we have a default way of understanding the world, it is very difficult to shake that paradigm. In fact, normal science, Thomas Kuhn says, wants to perpetuate itself. It is going to try its best to interpret any what I call naughty data. Inevitably, pretty much with any paradigm, you're going to have some data that doesn't really fit. I call it naughty data. And so the question is, what are you going to do with it? Well, our default is to find a way to explain it away. So let's say that you're a Democrat and you don't like President Trump, let's say. If President Trump does something that seems to be good, there's going to be a very strong impulse to find a way to explain away something good that President Trump did. It goes the other way as well. If you are a supporter of President Trump and he does something that seems a little off, you're going to be very strongly driven to try to find a way to explain it away. We are not objective creatures. And so if something doesn't fit the paradigm that is our default paradigm, we're gonna resist it probably. And of course, the more obvious the objectionable data is, the more frustrated we're going to get. I mean, there's some Facebook posts that seem pretty angry right now. And I ask myself, okay, why is this person so heated and so angry? Is it because of injustice, or is it more likely because deep down they know I'm really not able to support this position as well as I think I can? And so inevitably there is naughty data. The same goes with Scripture. I'm a Wesleyan Arminian, which means that I believe that God empowers everybody to have a free choice as to whether they serve God or not, that everybody who comes into the world could potentially make it into the kingdom of God, that God gives everybody a fair shot. Now, when I read Romans 9, I get a little nervous because it sure sounds like God creates some people for skeet shooting. Paul, that God creates some people so he can show how great he is in blasting them to Gehenna. And so I don't interpret Romans 9 that way. I deploy countermeasures. It's really about the Jews in Israel. Well, it was a group culture. Well, it was a fatalistic culture. Well, in chapter 11, some of those who've been predestined flip sides. And so I have my countermeasures, which I hope are true. But basically, there are naughty verses that don't fit within our theological paradigm as well. Take 1 Timothy 2:12. I believe in women in all roles of ministry and leadership. And yet it says, I do not allow a woman, or is it a wife, to teach or exercise authority, or is it to dominate over a man, or is it a husband? This is, in my mind, the only verse in the whole Bible. To me, this is the only verse in the entire Bible that sounds like it would prohibit a woman from teaching a man. All the other verses, I think, are pretty easily either show that women can be leaders and spiritual prophets and so forth, preachers, or are easily explained in terms of situation. 1 Timothy 2:12 is the only verse that is a naughty verse for me, in my opinion. I mean, you might say that the one in 1 Corinthians 14 is a naughty verse, but to me, that's fairly easily addressed. But so any of our theological paradigms will tend to have, except for the paradigm that God exists. There is no scripture that I think pulls against that. Even Esther doesn't mention God, but it's not anti the existence of God. So on most theological issues, we're going to find some verses in favor of our position and some verses that aren't in favor of our position. And I call verses that aren't in favor of our normal theology naughty verses. Well, the thing is, when you have these naughty verses or this naughty data, this data, these observations that don't fit within your paradigm, there are bound to be people who say, you know what, I don't think that's quite the right paradigm. Or what if there's another paradigm? And usually these voices face pretty strong resistance. And there's often generational things. I can tell you that those who are boomers and builders, even beyond the boomers, in the Wesleyan Church, sometimes they look at the millennials and the Gen Z Wesleyans, and they think these people are going liberal. I mean, of course, they thought that about their parents, thought that about them too. So it tends to kind of be a change is what's going on. Change is a constant in our days. In the last few centuries, change seems to be a constant, and so it's natural for the older generation that doesn't change to assume that the younger generation that has changed is evil or stupid. But you end up with this power struggle of those who are saying, well, what if you look at it this way? So, for example, in the Boomer Wesleyan generation, the issues of abortion and homosexuality are pretty much the moral issues. It's hard to find much of any other interest except maybe capitalism, which, as we said in our video on economic philosophy, there's a tendency to blur their human cultural paradigm with biblical paradigms. But so it's not that the younger generation necessarily disagrees with the older generation on everything, but there are other issues that are more important to them. They're more interested in race reconciliation. Sometimes, this is an overgeneralization, and they're more interested in addressing poverty, in addressing social injustice. And these are more central moral issues for them than abortion, which was an issue for the boomer kind of generation of Christians that came out of the Reagan synthesis of Jerry Falwell in the 80s. And so what happens a lot of times is the next generation changes its paradigm, and the older generation, no disrespect intended, they're not going to be around forever. And then it repeats itself all over again. But we can see this also in science, which is, of course, what Thomas Kuhn was looking at. When Max Planck in 1900 suggested that perhaps he could explain certain issues in radiation if energy exists in packets that he called quanta. Now, Planck didn't like this theory because it didn't fit with traditional theory of physics, but it made the math work. And so he suggested that, for the time being, until we figure out how the older paradigms are correct, let's operate with this new paradigm just so that we can make things work. Well, Einstein won the Nobel Prize in I don't forget when he won it, but for work he did in 1905, in which he showed that this idea of quanta actually explains the photoelectric effect very well, that you can irradiate a metal and nothing happened for a while until it reaches a certain critical mass, and then electrons start, or photons start jumping off the plate, and so forth. So Max did not want there to be a paradigm shift, but it helped. The science worked. Einstein with relativity. He did not win the Nobel Prize for relativity. We assume, well, surely that's what he won the prize for, because now everybody believes in relativity. But at the time, it wasn't at all so certain that it was true. Quantum physics. Einstein himself never accepted quantum physics the way that is now assumed by everybody. The idea that we cannot predict where certain things will be on the subatomic level, that there's a certain unpredictability to the universe. Einstein had his famous quote that God doesn't play dice, because that's, by dice he meant modern quantum physics. He spent the rest of his life trying to find another way to explain this. But of course, Einstein's not here anymore, and the prevailing paradigm is very clearly the position that he opposed. So once the opposers are gone, we have a new normal science, and we have what's called a paradigm shift. I don't know if you've ever heard about paradigm shift. It's now part of the common language of the world. We now talk about having a paradigm shift on something. All of this goes back to Thomas Kuhn, where he wrote his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. I've kind of been giving examples as we go along, but the Hebrew universe basically saw water underneath, waters on the edges of the universe, and there was this vault or firmament up that kept the waters above from the waters beneath. And then the stars were in the firmament in this kind of dome. That's not the way that we, when we read Genesis 1, if you read it in terms of Ken Ham or something like that, in my opinion, Ken Ham thinks that he's reading Genesis 1 literally. I would say he's not, that the literal reading of Genesis 1 is something not even he could handle, because it would be a flat earth with water straight down, water straight up. Ptolemy, of course, this picture behind me is a picture of the Ptolemaic universe, where the Earth is at the center, and then we have these concentric rings. Copernicus said, well, what if the sun is at the center with concentric circles? And then Kepler came along and said, well, the math doesn't quite work with Copernicus, but if we make them ellipses, then it works. These are examples of paradigm shifts that have happened throughout history. And we've kind of been in the Kepler one now for some time, although it's expanded, right? Now we're no longer, our solar system's not the center of anything. It's not the only thing going. We are in an obscure solar system in a massive Milky Way galaxy that's only one of millions of galaxies. Who knows how many galaxies? If you watch the video on what is a human person, we talk about paradigm shifts with regard to things like the soul. The Greek soul is a detachable part of me. The Hebrew soul is the whole of me. God took the dust body, he breathes into it, spirit, and Adam becomes a living soul, which is a whole living being, not just a human being, because Genesis 1 calls the sea creatures nephesh kaya, living souls in the water. And so there's something different between the Hebrew sense of a soul as an entire living being, to the Greek soul, which is often detachable, to Descartes, who saw, so the Greeks saw the soul as material, just very thin material. Descartes divided the world into the material and the immaterial, and the soul was not material, and the body was material. And he saw the soul as something that was connected to our pineal gland, if I remember correctly. But Descartes created this distinction between the natural and the supernatural, and our soul belonged to the supernatural. This is different from what the Bible says, although we have read the Bible with Cartesian glasses on ever since Descartes. And a lot of people today are non-reductive physicalists. That is, people who believe, I mean, there are Christians who believe that you cannot have a person without a body, that there is no detachable soul. But we are made in God's image, and we are more than just our bodies. It's non-reductive bodies. This is a fairly recent spin on it. Paradigm shift, they do. And I've just mentioned this, the difference between the natural supernatural division of Descartes, and before that we had more of a continuum of being, a flow that went from the human to the divine, and it's more of a continuous flow rather than a hard and fast division between the one and the other. And I've hinted at some paradigms that have changed over the years with regard to the Bible. So the Roman Catholic tradition reads the Bible in terms of transubstantiation, for example. The idea of transubstantiation is the idea that in communion, the essence of the bread and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. Now, I don't know what that means, because they're not saying that the atomic structure or molecular structure changes. Aristotle didn't know anything about atoms. Aristotle believed that there was an essence to things that you couldn't see. There was a form and the substance. And so you can't ever see the substance. That's mighty convenient, isn't it, for Aquinas to say that the substance changes into Christ, but the form looks the same. To me, this is, again, I'm not being hostile. I'm just saying this is just an example of the Aristotelian worldview prior to the scientific revolution. And so many Protestants have a different view. The Lutheran paradigm viewed Paul through a very hard and fast division between faith and works. The problem is, of course, that works still play a major role in the New Testament. I was looking at Revelation 22 today, which talks about the importance of works and so forth. And James, of course, talks about justification by works. So you could argue that the Lutheran paradigm was reacting to the Roman Catholic paradigm, but it was still a paradigm that needed some refining. There's the Calvinist paradigm with regard to predestination. I have a Wesleyan paradigm, I would say, and I grew up with various interpretations which fit with that Wesleyan paradigm. So I grew up with an interpretation of Acts 2 that saw the Spirit fillings on the day of Pentecost as them being entirely sanctified, even though the words entirely sanctified don't actually appear. Christian perfection doesn't appear in Acts 2. It was a lens, a pair of glasses used to read Acts chapter 2. I'm still in the Wesleyan tradition. I'm still a Wesleyan, but my sense of individual passages may have changed here and there over the years, and I might say with great pain. This was not something I just jumped to because I'm a rabble rouser, although maybe some people think I am. My paradigms, those paradigms changed with great reluctance and resistance. But I at some point, I flipped a paradigm. So when I went to college, my paradigm was, I wouldn't have said this necessarily, but when I went to college, my paradigm was, how can I fit my new learning into my old paradigm? And in my senior year of college, I flipped it to, well, it may have even been in seminary, it may not have been in college. Eventually, I flipped the paradigm to what is true. I want to believe what is true. I don't want to just believe what's convenient or what my past is. I want to believe what is actually true, which is a paradigm shift. There's a Pentecostal paradigm on Acts. that reads all the spirit fillings in Acts as involving the speaking of tongues. Well, there are some spirit fillings in Acts that don't mention tongues. Paul's conversion in Acts 9 doesn't mention speaking in tongues. The conversion of the Samaritans in Acts 10 doesn't mention speaking in tongues. So you see how our paradigms, we read things into things on the basis of our paradigm. There's a fundamentalist paradigm that reads certain verses and says, of course. Take 2 Timothy 3:16, I think it is, that says all scripture is God-breathed and is profitable for instruction, correction, and reproof, and training in righteousness. In the 1950s, that verse was read by neo-evangelicals to say, basically, therefore, the literal meaning of the Bible is true. And of course, the literal meaning of the Bible is true. But the point of that verse is not to point to necessarily literal interpretations. If you look at the way that Paul interprets the Old Testament, he doesn't always interpret the Old Testament literally. Like in 1 Corinthians 9, he says, there's a verse in Deuteronomy, do not muzzle the ox while it's treading the grain. And Paul says, this is not about oxen, this is about us. Ministers should be supported materially for the work that they're doing. So you see, the inspired meaning that Paul sees in Scripture isn't necessarily a literal meaning. And if you look at what it says Scripture is profitable for, it's primarily things that have to do with how we live, being righteous, about living the right way or living the wrong way. And so, again, it wasn't primarily cognitive ideas that 2 Timothy has in mind, that all the theology of Scripture is inspired. That's not what Paul's focusing on. Paul is focusing on manner of how to live in this world, how to be righteous, and so forth. So these assumptions of people like C.F.H. Henry in the 1950s are a particular paradigm. That the Bible is basically a collection of propositions. Well, most of the Bible is story. You also have Proverbs and you have Psalms, which are expressive. You have apocalyptic, different genres. So we have paradigms, and we are resistant usually to change